Welcome to West Film. We bring you the best movie recaps, reviews, ending explained videos, and hidden details from your favorite films. If you love great movies, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Now grab some popcorn, and let's jump into today's movie. Above the Law turned out to be the perfect showcase for these talents. The film introduced audiences to a protagonist who could take down multiple opponents with apparent ease while staying calm and in control throughout. Its success instantly established Seagal as a bankable action star, launching a career that would go on to include major hits like Hard to Kill, Marked for Death, Out for Justice, and Under Siege. For several years, Seagal was one of the most recognizable faces in action cinema, holding his own alongside established stars like Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone, and Jean-Claude Van Damme. Opposite Seagal was Pam Grier, who played Detective Dolores Jackson. By the time she joined the cast, Grier was already a legendary figure in American cinema. During the 1970s, she'd become one of the defining stars of the blaxploitation genre through films like Coffee and Foxy Brown. Her performances made her an icon because she portrayed strong, intelligent, capable women at a time when such roles were relatively rare in mainstream action films. Grier brought credibility, experience, and charisma to Above the Law. Her character served as both a partner and an ally to Nico, helping ground the story while adding another layer of toughness to the narrative. Although her role wasn't the central focus, her presence elevated the production considerably. For audiences already familiar with her earlier work, seeing her alongside a newcomer like Seagal created an interesting contrast between an established screen legend and an emerging action star. The film also helped keep Grier visible during a stretch when Hollywood wasn't offering many leading roles to actresses who defined earlier decades. Years later, she'd experience a major career resurgence through Quentin Tarantino's Jackie Brown, a performance that reminded audiences and critics alike of her exceptional talent. Henry Silva played the primary antagonist, Kurt Zagan. Silva had already built a long, impressive career playing villains in crime films, westerns, and action movies. His distinctive appearance, commanding voice, and intimidating presence made him one of Hollywood's most reliable screen villains. Throughout the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s, Silva frequently appeared in international productions, often cast as a gangster, assassin, or corrupt official. In Above the Law, his experience proved invaluable as his portrayal of Zagan gave the film a credible, genuinely dangerous antagonist capable of standing opposite Seagal's nearly invincible hero. Silva knew how to build menace without overdoing it, which made the character feel believable rather than cartoonish, a reflection of the professionalism of an actor who'd spent decades mastering villainous roles. Sharon Stone appears in the film as Sarah Toscani, Nico's wife. At the time, Stone was still early in her career. She'd appeared in several films and TV projects, but hadn't yet reached the worldwide fame that would arrive a few years later. Looking back, Above the Law offers an interesting glimpse of an actress who'd eventually become one of Hollywood's biggest stars. Stone brought intelligence and warmth to a role that could easily have been underwritten. Although her screen time is limited compared to some of the other major performers, her presence helps humanize Nico and reminds audiences that he has responsibilities beyond his dangerous investigations. Her performance hinted at qualities that would later become hallmarks of her career: confidence, elegance, and a natural ability to command attention on screen. Within a few years, Stone achieved international stardom through films like Total Recall, Basic Instinct, Casino, and The Quick and the Dead. Watching Above the Law today lets viewers glimpse an early stage in the development of one of the defining actresses of the 1990s. Ron Dean, a veteran character actor with deep ties to Chicago filmmaking, played Detective Lukic. Dean was known for playing police officers, detectives, and other authority figures, and his familiarity with crime dramas and law enforcement characters added authenticity to the film. Throughout his career, he appeared in countless movies and TV series, becoming one of those recognizable faces audiences remember even if they can't quite place the name. The supporting cast also included performers like Chelsea Ross, Jack Wallace, and Joseph Greco, each contributing to the film's atmosphere of political intrigue and criminal conspiracy. Together, these actors helped build a believable world full of corrupt officials, determined investigators, and dangerous criminals. When Above the Law was released in 1988, it entered a cinematic landscape dominated by larger-than-life action heroes, Cold War anxieties, political distrust, and a growing public fascination with covert government operations. While the film was initially marketed as a straightforward action thriller, its long-term cultural significance extends well beyond its box office performance. The movie arrived at a moment when audiences were increasingly drawn to stories about government corruption, secret intelligence programs, and individuals willing to challenge powerful institutions. In many ways, Above the Law captured the mood of its era while also helping shape the direction of action cinema for years to come. One of the film's most important contributions to popular culture was introducing Steven Seagal as a new kind of action hero. During the 1980s, audiences were used to the muscular, explosive styles of stars like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone, whose characters typically relied on overwhelming firepower, massive physical strength, and spectacular destruction. Seagal's Nico Toscani offered something different, calm instead of loud, controlled instead of reckless, and grounded in martial arts techniques that looked genuinely practical and efficient. That distinction helped create a new subgenre within action films. Seagal's fighting style, based largely on Aikido, fascinated audiences because it looked unlike any martial art they'd seen in the movies before. Rather than flashy kicks or elaborate acrobatics, he relied on throws, locks, and redirected force. The realism of these techniques gave the action sequences a unique identity, and as a result, many later action films tried to replicate elements of this style, pushing close-quarters combat to the forefront through the late 1980s and early 1990s. The film also arrived at a particularly charged moment in American political history. The late 1980s were marked by growing skepticism toward government institutions, following a decade of controversies involving intelligence agencies, military operations, and foreign policy decisions. Although Above the Law is fictional, its story of corrupt officials, secret operations, and government misconduct resonated with audiences who were already questioning the actions of powerful institutions. The movie's references to covert activities and intelligence operations echoed conversations happening in the real world at the time. Throughout the 1980s, news coverage frequently focused on secret government programs, unauthorized operations, and questions of accountability. So audiences found the film's conspiracy narrative believable. It mirrored real-world concerns. The idea that dangerous individuals could operate within government structures while staying protected by their influence felt entirely plausible to many viewers. This atmosphere of distrust became a defining characteristic of numerous action and thriller films from the period. Above the Law helped reinforce a trend in which heroes had to fight not just criminals but corruption within their own institutions. The protagonist's struggle against powerful forces reflected a growing cultural belief that justice sometimes requires challenging the very systems built to uphold it. Another significant part of the film's cultural impact lies in its portrayal of law enforcement. Nico Toscani is presented as a police officer who refuses to compromise his principles despite pressure from superiors and powerful political interests. In an era when many action films celebrated independent-minded heroes, Nico became another example of the individual standing against institutional corruption. This theme resonated strongly because it tapped into broader American ideals about personal responsibility and moral courage. The character's willingness to risk his career, safety, and reputation in pursuit of the truth reinforced the idea that ethical individuals can make a difference even against powerful adversaries, a narrative structure that would become increasingly common throughout action cinema over the following decade. The movie also helped fuel growing mainstream interest in martial arts. Martial arts films had already found success through performers like Bruce Lee and Jackie Chan, but Above the Law introduced a style that felt more grounded and realistic. The film encouraged greater interest in self-defense and martial arts training, particularly Aikido, which saw a surge in visibility following Seagal's rise to fame. Many viewers were seeing Aikido demonstrated on a major cinematic stage for the first time. The art's emphasis on leverage, balance, and redirection made for action scenes that felt both effective and accessible, and martial arts schools across various countries reported increased interest during the peak of Seagal's popularity. Many factors contributed to that trend, but Above the Law clearly played a role in bringing these techniques to a broad audience. The film's Vietnam War-related conspiracy elements also tapped into ongoing cultural conversations about the legacy of that conflict. More than a decade after it ended, American society was still grappling with its consequences, and films throughout the 1980s frequently revisited Vietnam, exploring themes of trauma, political failure, and unresolved historical questions. Above the Law folded elements of this broader discussion into its story by tying its conspiracy narrative to events rooted in that era. In doing so, it joined a larger group of films examining Vietnam's lingering effects on American institutions and individuals. While it approached these themes through the lens of an action thriller rather than a war drama, it still participated in an ongoing national conversation about accountability, secrecy, and historical memory within popular culture. Above the Law also helped establish several recurring Steven Seagal trademarks that would later become widely recognized. The story behind the making of Above the Law is almost as fascinating as the story on screen. While audiences remember the film as Steven Seagal's debut and the start of a major action franchise-like career, the production itself was full of unusual circumstances, industry skepticism, creative experimentation, and no small amount of risk. Looking back decades later, it's clear that Above the Law wasn't simply another action movie assembled by a Hollywood studio. It was a carefully constructed launch vehicle designed to introduce an entirely new star to audiences while capitalizing on emerging trends in martial arts cinema, crime thrillers, and political conspiracy stories. One of the more unusual aspects of the production was how Steven Seagal broke into Hollywood in the first place. Unlike most actors, who spend years auditioning for small roles before landing a lead, Seagal's path was highly unconventional. Before acting, he was known within martial arts circles as an Aikido instructor and dojo owner, and his reputation had spread throughout that community thanks to his technical skill, his teaching ability, and his unusual background as an American who'd achieved considerable success in Japan. According to industry accounts from the period, several influential Hollywood figures became interested in Seagal after seeing demonstrations of his martial arts techniques. Producers were struck by how different Aikido looked compared to the fighting styles typically featured in action movies. At the time, audiences were already familiar with the explosive kicks of martial arts stars and the brute force combat of traditional action heroes. Seagal's movements looked smoother, more realistic, and in some ways more intimidating, because they relied on leverage and control rather than flashy athleticism. The project eventually caught the attention of producer Andrew Davis, who'd later become one of the most respected directors in the action thriller genre. Davis had already built a reputation for gritty, realistic films with a strong attention to detail, and rather than treat Above the Law as a simple martial arts showcase, He wanted to build a legitimate crime thriller around Seagal's abilities. That decision proved crucial, helping distinguish the film from the countless low-budget martial arts productions flooding the market during the 1980s. Davis brought strong visual and narrative discipline to the project, emphasizing realism, authentic locations, and believable law enforcement procedures wherever possible. Instead of building a fantasy world where a hero simply fights one opponent after another, Davis grounded the story in political conspiracies, police investigations, and institutional corruption, a combination of action and realism that gave the film a stronger foundation than many of its competitors. A major challenge during production was convincing studio executives that Steven Seagal could carry an entire feature film. His martial arts skills were undeniable, but he had virtually no acting experience compared to established stars, and launching an unknown performer as a lead in a theatrical action movie was a significant financial gamble, and many newcomers had failed in similar situations before. To address these concerns, the filmmakers surrounded Seagal with experienced performers. Veterans like Pam Grier and Silva brought professionalism and credibility to the cast, reassuring both the studio and audiences that the film wouldn't rely entirely on its inexperienced lead. Their presence also helped strengthen scenes by bringing years of screen experience to every interaction. The production's Chicago setting was another important creative decision. Rather than filming primarily on studio backlots, the filmmakers made heavy use of real-world locations throughout the city. Chicago had already established itself as a popular filming destination thanks to its distinctive architecture, urban atmosphere, and visual diversity, and it offered an authentic environment that enhanced the film's gritty tone. Many scenes were shot on actual streets and in real neighborhoods, creating a sense of realism audiences could immediately recognize. The urban landscapes added significantly to the movie's atmosphere, grounding the story in a believable world rather than an artificial movie set. A commitment to location shooting that reflected Andrew Davis's preference for authenticity, a trait that would become even more evident in later films like The Fugitive. The action sequences presented another interesting production challenge. Because Seagal's martial arts style differed so dramatically from what audiences expected, the filmmakers had to carefully design fight scenes that showcased his abilities while keeping them visually clear. Traditional action choreography often relied on exaggerated movements meant to look spectacular on camera, but Aikido emphasizes efficiency and subtle technique instead. So the stunt coordinators and filmmakers developed a distinctive approach. Camera angles were chosen to highlight the fluidity of Seagal's movements, letting viewers appreciate how effortlessly he seemed to control his opponents. Many fights were intentionally shot to emphasize realism over spectacle, a decision that helped establish the unique identity that would define Seagal's early career. Several crew members later recalled that Seagal preferred performing many of his own action sequences, even though stunt doubles were still used when necessary. He was eager to demonstrate his martial arts skills personally, and that willingness added authenticity to the action scenes because audiences could clearly see the lead actor executing many of the techniques himself. Another notable aspect of the production involved the screenplay's political themes. During the late 1980s, stories about government conspiracies and intelligence agencies were drawing considerable public interest. The writers folded in elements inspired by real-world concerns about covert operations, political scandals, and secret government activities. The film is fictional, but its subject matter felt contemporary and relevant to audiences familiar with the headlines of the era. Above the Law follows a classic action thriller structure, but what makes it particularly interesting is how it blends police procedural elements, political conspiracy, espionage, and martial arts action into a single narrative. Rather than leaning solely on explosions and fight scenes, the movie gradually builds a mystery that unfolds layer by layer, letting the audience discover the truth alongside its protagonist. The result is a story that works not just as an action film but as an investigation into corruption, abuse of power, and the hidden criminal networks operating beneath the surface of society. The film opens by introducing Nico Toscani, a character whose background immediately sets him apart from the typical movie cop. Before becoming a Chicago detective, Nico served in the military and later worked with intelligence agencies during the Vietnam era. These experiences matter because they establish him as someone familiar with both legitimate government operations and the darker activities that can exist behind official institutions. The opening sections of the film serve several purposes at once. First, they establish Nico as a highly skilled, disciplined individual capable of handling dangerous situations. Second, they introduce his family life, showing that he's not just an action hero but also a husband and father. Finally, they hint at his past, planting the seeds of the knowledge and secrets he carries from earlier stages of his life. This groundwork matters because it gives audiences reasons to invest in the character before the central conflict kicks in. Many action films of the era jumped straight into physical action above the law. Instead takes time to establish Nico's personal and professional identity, which makes later events feel more meaningful. The story's inciting incident occurs when Nico gets pulled into a routine police investigation that seems relatively straightforward at first. What initially looks like ordinary law enforcement work gradually reveals connections to a much larger and more dangerous conspiracy. This narrative technique works well because it mirrors the protagonist's own experience. Both Nico and the audience start out with limited information and slowly uncover the truth together as clues pile up. The investigation leads to a network involving former intelligence operatives, political influence, organized crime, and individuals wielding significant power within government structures. The film carefully widens the scope of the conspiracy, turning what appeared to be a local criminal matter into something with national implications. One of the screenplay's strengths in this section is its pacing. Rather than revealing every secret at once, the narrative doles out information gradually. Each discovery raises new questions, keeping viewers engaged, and the story frequently alternates between investigation scenes, character interactions, and action sequences, so no single element dominates for too long. As the conspiracy comes into focus, Nico realizes that many of the people responsible are protected by political influence and institutional connections. That realization shifts the narrative from a straightforward police investigation into a broader struggle against corruption. The protagonist is no longer simply trying to solve a crime, he's now confronting people who operate above the law, a concept reflected directly in the film's title. This shift marks one of the story's most important turning points. Up to this point, Nico believes the legal system might be capable of resolving the situation. As evidence piles up, though, he starts to understand that the institutions meant to enforce justice have been compromised. The conflict becomes both external and internal. He has to fight dangerous enemies while navigating a system that seems unwilling, or unable, to hold them accountable. The middle portion of the film significantly raises the stakes. Nico becomes a target because of what he knows and the questions he keeps asking. Various attempts are made to intimidate, discredit, or eliminate him, and the tension builds as the audience recognizes just how seriously the conspiracy's leaders view him as a threat. Meanwhile, the story explores how Nico's actions ripple into his personal life. His family grows increasingly vulnerable as the danger surrounding the investigation escalates. This matters because it humanizes the protagonist. The audience comes to understand that determination carries real risks and real sacrifices. Another notable element of the film's structure is how the action scenes are woven into the investigation rather than existing on their own. Most confrontations happen because Nico uncovers information, pursues suspects, or defends himself against people trying to silence him. which creates a strong sense of narrative momentum. Every action sequence pushes the story forward rather than interrupting it. The villains contribute significantly to the plot's effectiveness too. Rather than functioning as simple, greed-driven criminals, they're tied to historical events, covert operations, and abuses of power, with motivations rooted in self-preservation and the desire to protect their influence. That makes them more complex than many action movie antagonists of the era. As the investigation builds toward its climax, Nico gathers enough evidence to expose the conspiracy, but obtaining proof is only part of the challenge. He also has to survive long enough to reveal it. The final act combines traditional thriller elements with increasingly intense action, and the climax follows a structure common to many successful action films but executes it with real effectiveness. The protagonist confronts the people responsible for the conspiracy while fighting for his own survival, with tension arising not only from physical danger but from uncertainty over whether the truth will actually come out. Although Above the Law is often remembered primarily as an action thriller and the film that launched Steven Seagal's movie career, a closer look reveals a story built around several surprisingly substantial themes. Beneath the martial arts sequences, gunfights, and political intrigue lies a narrative concerned with corruption, justice, loyalty, truth, power, and the moral responsibilities of people operating within institutions. The film uses its conspiracy-driven plot not just to entertain but to explore questions of authority and accountability, themes that help elevate the movie beyond simple action spectacle and explain why it still draws attention decades after its release. The most obvious and important theme is the abuse of power. Nearly every major conflict in the film revolves around people who have authority and choose to use it for personal gain rather than public service. The title itself points directly at this idea, suggesting the existence of people who believe they're exempt from the rules that govern ordinary citizens. Throughout the story, powerful figures exploit their positions to conceal crimes, manipulate investigations, and shield themselves from consequences. This theme resonates because it taps into a fear present in many societies, that those entrusted with authority may become corrupted by it. The film argues that power without accountability creates the conditions where injustice can flourish. Nico Toscani's struggle against these individuals turns the movie into a broader examination of institutional corruption. The villains aren't merely criminals operating outside the system, they've embedded themselves within structures that are supposed to protect the public. That distinction matters because it makes the threat feel more complex and more frightening. The enemy isn't external, but internal. Closely tied to this is the theme of justice versus legality. One of the central questions the film raises is whether following official procedures is always enough to achieve justice. Nico repeatedly runs into situations where legal systems appear compromised or ineffective. Evidence disappears, investigations get obstructed, and powerful individuals manipulate institutions to dodge punishment. The film isn't suggesting laws don't matter. Instead, it explores the tension between legal authority and moral responsibility. Nico stays committed to justice even when official channels fail him, creating an ongoing conflict between what's technically permitted and what's ethically right. This theme has recurred in action cinema for decades because it appeals to audiences' sense of fairness. Viewers often identify with heroes who refuse to accept corruption just because it's been legalized or shielded by powerful interests. The movie ultimately presents justice as something larger than legal procedure alone. Another major theme involves truth and deception. Nearly every important character is affected by hidden information, secrets, or deliberate misinformation. The conspiracy at the story's center survives because the truth has been buried under layers of lies and manipulation. Nico's journey, then, can be viewed as a search for truth. As he gathers evidence, interviews witnesses, and follows leads, he gradually exposes realities that others have worked hard to conceal. The film repeatedly suggests that uncovering the truth takes persistence, courage, and a willingness to challenge accepted narratives. which reflects the structure of the movie itself. The audience learns information at the same pace as the protagonist, creating a shared investigative experience where every revelation reshapes the viewer's understanding of events and reinforces truth as a central narrative force. The film also explores loyalty and betrayal. Several characters are forced to choose between personal loyalty, professional obligations, and moral principles. Some stay true to their values despite enormous pressure, while others abandon those values in exchange for power, money, or protection. Nico represents unwavering loyalty to justice and integrity, even when threatened, isolated, or placed in danger. He refuses to compromise. The antagonists, by contrast, embody betrayal. They've abandoned the responsibilities tied to their positions in favor of self-interest. This contrast creates the moral framework that defines the film's characters. Heroes are marked by their commitment to principle, villains by their willingness to sacrifice that principle for personal benefit. Family serves as another important thematic thread. While the film focuses heavily on investigations and action, Nico's family remains a constant presence throughout, reminding viewers that his actions carry personal consequences. Family functions symbolically here, representing what Nico is fighting to protect. Other conspiracy threatens not just political stability or legal institutions but ordinary people trying to live normal lives. By emphasizing Nico's role as husband and father, the film grounds its larger themes in everyday human experience, reinforcing the idea that Nico isn't motivated solely by professional duty. He wants to build a safer world for the people he loves. His commitment, in other words, goes beyond abstract notions of justice and becomes deeply personal. Another significant theme is individual courage. Throughout the narrative, Nico frequently finds himself isolated. Powerful institutions oppose him, dangerous enemies target him, and plenty of people would rather he stop asking questions. Despite all that, he keeps going. The film presents courage not as fearlessness but as perseverance. One of the most underrated aspects of Above the Law is its visual presentation. While audiences often remember the film for introducing Steven Seagal and showcasing his martial arts abilities, its visual style plays a major role in shaping its identity. Unlike many late 1980s action films that leaned on flashy editing, exaggerated spectacle, or heavily stylized imagery, Above the Law takes a more grounded, realistic approach. Director Andrew Davis and his cinematography team built a visual language emphasizing authenticity, tension, and urban realism while still delivering the excitement audiences expect from an action thriller. The film's overall visual philosophy is built around credibility. From the opening scenes onward, the movie works to convince viewers that the events unfolding on screen could actually happen. That commitment to realism shapes everything, from location choices and lighting to camera placement and action choreography. Rather than building a heightened fantasy world, the filmmakers placed the audience inside a recognizable environment where corruption, violence, and conspiracy feel disturbingly plausible. One of the film's most important visual elements is its use of real locations. Much of Above the Law was shot in and around Chicago, and the city practically becomes a character in its own right. Unlike productions that lean heavily on studios' sets, the movie frequently places its actors within actual streets, neighborhoods, offices, warehouses, and other urban settings, which creates an immediate sense of authenticity. Viewers can feel the difference between a real city and a manufactured backdrop. The architecture, weather, traffic, and atmosphere all add up to a lived-in realism that strengthens the narrative. Chicago's visual identity enhances the film's themes of political corruption and hidden criminal activity, since the city feels large, complex, and capable of concealing dangerous secrets beneath its surface. The cinematography often emphasizes this urban environment through wide establishing shots that orient the audience while reinforcing the scale of the world Nico Toscani operates in. The city frequently appears imposing and complicated, visually mirroring the conspiracy the protagonist is trying to unravel. Lighting plays a crucial role throughout. Above the Law generally avoids the bright, colorful aesthetic found in many mainstream action movies of the period, favoring a more subdued and naturalistic scheme instead. Interiors often rely on practical light sources like desk lamps, overhead fixtures, and window light, which contributes to the documentary-like realism running through much of the movie. Night scenes are particularly effective as shadows are used to create uncertainty and tension, reinforcing the film's themes of secrecy and hidden agendas, with characters often moving through dimly lit environments where danger could emerge at any moment. These visual choices help transform ordinary locations into spaces charged with suspense. The color palette is similarly restrained, favoring earth tones, grays, blues, and muted urban colors rather than vibrant or exaggerated hues. That palette reflects the story's serious tone. Bright colors are rarely used because they'd undercut the atmosphere of realism the filmmakers are working to maintain. The subdued color scheme also reinforces the narrative's moral complexity. This isn't a world neatly divided into heroes and villains marked by obvious visual symbols. Instead, the film presents a morally ambiguous environment where corruption hides behind respectable appearances, and the neutral palette supports that idea by avoiding simplistic visual distinctions. Camera movement throughout the film is generally controlled and purposeful. Andrew Davis avoids excessive stylistic flourishes that might distract from the story. Instead, the camera is often positioned to observe events clearly and efficiently. This lets viewers focus on character interactions and plot developments without being overwhelmed by visual gimmicks. During investigative sequences, the camera often behaves almost like an observer following Nico's progress, a technique that encourages audience identification with the protagonist. Viewers experience discoveries, confrontations, and revelations right alongside him, creating a stronger emotional connection to the narrative. The action scenes represent one of the film's most distinctive visual achievements. At the time of release, Seagal's Aikido-based fighting style looked dramatically different from what audiences were used to. Many martial arts films relied on rapid kicks, acrobatics, and heavily choreographed exchanges, while Seagal's technique emphasized efficiency, balance, and control. The cinematography was carefully designed to showcase these qualities rather than cutting rapidly between angles. Many fight scenes let movements play out clearly on screen, helping audiences appreciate the mechanics of the techniques being used. The throws, joint locks, and defensive maneuvers are visible and understandable, which increases their impact. This clarity becomes one of the defining characteristics of the film's action. The audience isn't merely watching violence, they're watching a specific martial arts philosophy in motion. The visual presentation highlights how effortlessly Nico seems to neutralize threats, reinforcing his image as an exceptionally capable protagonist. Close-up shots are used strategically throughout the film. During confrontations and moments of tension, the camera frequently moves in closer on characters' faces, letting viewers catch subtle reactions and emotions. Particularly effective during scenes involving political intrigue or moral conflict. Steven Seagal's performance benefits considerably from this technique, since his acting style relies heavily on controlled expressions and restrained body language. The close-ups let those details register, reinforcing the character's calm, disciplined nature. The villains get similar treatment. Henry Silva's Kurt Zagan is often framed to emphasize authority and menace, with careful composition and camera angles establishing him as a credible threat even before he takes direct action, a choice that strengthens the film's dramatic tension. While Above the Law is often remembered for its action sequences, political conspiracy storyline, and Steven Seagal's debut as a leading man, the soundtrack and sound design play a crucial role in shaping the overall experience. Audio is one of the most powerful tools available to filmmakers, and in Above the Law it's used carefully to build tension, establish atmosphere, enhance realism, and support the characters' emotional journeys. Unlike some action films of the 1980s that leaned heavily on loud, bombastic musical cues and larger-than-life sound effects, Above the Law adopts a more restrained, purposeful approach that fits its grounded style. The musical score was composed by David Michael Frank, a composer known for versatile, effective work across multiple genres. By the time he worked on Above the Law, Frank already had experience balancing suspense, drama, and action in his music, and his work here shows a strong understanding of how a score can support a narrative without overwhelming it. One of the score's most noticeable qualities is its subtlety. Rather than constantly drawing attention to itself, the music often operates beneath the surface, shaping audience emotions without becoming the center of attention. That approach fits the film's overall aesthetic perfectly. Above the Law aims to feel realistic and believable, and an overly dramatic score would have undermined that goal. The main musical themes are built around suspense and tension. Throughout the film, viewers are reminded that a dangerous conspiracy lurks beneath the visible surface of society, and the score frequently uses low tones, restrained melodies, and ominous textures to create a feeling of unease. Even during quieter scenes, the music often suggests something is wrong, keeping audiences alert and engaged. This technique works especially well during investigative sequences as Nico follows leads, interviews witnesses, and uncovers hidden connections. The music subtly reinforces the mystery. Rather than giving away answers, the score raises questions, building anticipation and encouraging viewers to think ahead. The conspiracy elements of the narrative benefit greatly from this approach, since many scenes involve conversations, discoveries, or gradual reveals that, in less capable hands, might feel slow or overly expository. The soundtrack helps maintain momentum by keeping a constant undercurrent of tension running beneath these moments. Action scenes call for a different musical strategy, and the score adapts accordingly, becoming more energetic and aggressive during physical confrontations, though it never fully abandons the film's commitment to realism. Rather than turning every fight into a grand spectacle, the soundtrack emphasizes urgency and danger. That restraint matters because Seagal's fighting style differs so much from many action heroes of the period. His Aikido techniques are built on efficiency, control, and precision, and the music supports those qualities by heightening the intensity of the scenes without exaggerating them. The result is action that feels immediate and believable rather than purely theatrical. Another strength of the soundtrack is how it supports character development. Nico Toscani is calm, disciplined, and highly focused, and the music surrounding his scenes tends to reflect those qualities rather than paint him as an unstoppable superhero, emphasizing determination and professionalism instead. This distinguishes Above the Law from many action films of the era. Some movies use music primarily to celebrate a hero's strength and invincibility. Here, the soundtrack leans more into the seriousness of the situation and the challenges facing the protagonist. Nico may be highly skilled, but the music reminds audiences that the threats are real and the stakes are significant. The emotional scenes involving Nico's family get particularly careful musical treatment. These moments remind viewers that the protagonist is more than a fighter or investigator. He's also a husband and father whose actions affect the people he loves. The score turns softer and more reflective during these sequences, creating a contrast with the tension and danger found elsewhere in the film. This emotional variation matters because it keeps the movie from feeling one-dimensional by giving quieter moments room to breathe musically. The soundtrack helps audiences connect with the characters on a more personal level, and the family scenes become emotionally meaningful rather than simply serving as narrative obligation. Sound design is just as important to the film's success. One reason Above the Law feels more grounded than many action movies is its commitment to realistic audio. Gunshots, footsteps, vehicle sounds, and environmental noise are all presented in a way that supports the film's authentic atmosphere. The gunfire, for instance, generally avoids the exaggerated qualities often heard in action cinema. Weapons sound powerful and dangerous without becoming cartoonishly loud, reinforcing the seriousness of violent encounters and adding to the film's overall realism. Similarly, the sound effects during fight scenes emphasize physical impact. Every throw, strike, and collision carries weight, and the audience can hear bodies hitting walls, floors, and objects with convincing force. These sounds make the combat feel tangible and help communicate just how effective Nico's martial arts techniques really are. The sound team also pays close attention to environmental audio. Urban locations are filled with background noise that makes the city feel alive. Traffic, distant conversations, machinery, sirens, and other ambient sounds create a believable sense of place. Viewers might not consciously notice these details, but they contribute significantly to immersion. Chicago itself gets partially defined through sound. The city doesn't just appear on screen, it's heard as well, and the combination of visual and auditory detail helps create a convincing urban environment that supports the story's themes of hidden corruption and political intrigue. When Above the Law premiered in 1988, it entered an extremely competitive action movie landscape. The decade was full of larger-than-life heroes, explosive blockbusters, and established stars whose names alone could draw a crowd. Audiences had already embraced performers like Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone, Chuck Norris, and other action icons. Against that backdrop, Above the Law faced the challenge of introducing a completely unknown leading man while convincing audiences he belonged alongside some of the biggest stars in Hollywood. The film's reception on release was generally positive, with audiences and mixed among professional critics. Reviewers disagreed on certain aspects of the movie, but there was widespread recognition that Steven Seagal represented something new within the action genre. Even critics who weren't entirely won over by the story often acknowledged that the film succeeded in introducing a distinctive screen presence who immediately stood apart from his contemporaries. Commercially, the movie performed well. Produced on a relatively modest budget compared to many major action films of the period, Above the Law generated strong box office returns and quickly proved there was significant audience interest in Steven Seagal. That commercial success was arguably the most important outcome of the film's release, since it transformed Seagal from an unknown martial arts instructor into a bankable movie star almost overnight. Studio executives pay close attention to profitability, and Above the Law delivered exactly what producers had hoped for, earning considerably more than its production cost and demonstrating that audiences were willing to support a new action hero. That financial success immediately opened doors for future projects, leading directly to the string of action films that would define Seagal's career throughout the late 1980s and early 1990s. One of the most frequently praised aspects of the film was its action choreography. Viewers were fascinated by Seagal's Aikido-based fighting style because it looked fundamentally different from what they'd seen in mainstream action cinema before. Many action heroes relied on brute force, powerful punches, or spectacular kicks. Seagal's techniques emphasized leverage, throws, joint locks, and efficiency. For audiences, that created a fresh experience. The fights felt more realistic and controlled than many popular martial arts sequences of the time. Numerous reviews specifically singled out the combat scenes as one of the film's strongest features. Even critics who found fault elsewhere often admitted the action was engaging and distinctive. Steven Seagal himself became one of the most discussed elements of the film, and reactions to his performance varied considerably. Supporters praised his confidence, screen presence, and authenticity, appreciating that he appeared genuinely capable of performing the techniques shown on screen. His calm demeanor also set him apart from more energetic or comedic action heroes. Some critics, however, questioned his acting ability, Given that Above the Law was his first major film role, comparisons to more experienced performers were inevitable. Certain reviewers felt his line delivery lacked emotional range and that his performance leaned too heavily on physical presence rather than dramatic expression. Despite that criticism, many audiences saw his stoic style as an asset rather than a weakness. Nico Toscani's quiet confidence became part of the character's appeal, and in later years, that reserved quality would become one of Seagal's defining trademarks. The film's conspiracy-driven plot generated similarly mixed reactions. Supporters appreciated the political intrigue and investigative elements that gave the movie more depth than a typical action film. Other stories focus on corruption, intelligence operations, and abuse of power added a layer of complexity that many viewers found engaging. Some critics praised the screenplay for blending multiple genres. The movie functions simultaneously as a police procedural, political thriller, conspiracy drama, and martial arts action film, which helped distinguish it from more straightforward action pictures. On the other hand, some reviewers felt the narrative occasionally became overly complicated. The conspiracy involves numerous characters, hidden agendas, and political connections, which some critics felt made the story hard to follow at times, while others argued the film spent so much energy building the conspiracy that certain supporting characters didn't get enough development. Pam Grier's performance received generally favorable responses. Many critics appreciated her presence and professionalism, noting that she brought credibility and experience to the production, having already established herself as an influential figure in 1970s action cinema. Grier provided a sense of continuity between earlier generations of action films and this emerging wave of late 1980s thrillers. Henry Silva's portrayal of Kurt Zagan also earned praise. Reviewers frequently highlighted his ability to create an intimidating, believable villain. Silva had spent decades refining the art of playing antagonists, and that experience showed throughout the film. His performance helped raise the stakes of the story by giving Nico a genuinely formidable opponent. Andrew Davis's direction was another aspect that drew positive attention. Critics generally credited him with maintaining suspense and creating a convincing atmosphere. Many reviewers noted that the film felt more grounded and realistic than a lot of action movies from the same period. Davis's emphasis on authentic locations, practical action, and urban realism contributed significantly to the movie's credibility, and these qualities became even more appreciated in hindsight, after Davis went on to major success directing films like Executive Decision. Looking back, many observers recognize Above the Law as an early example of the strengths that would come to define his work. No one watching Above the Law at the time could have predicted the long-term impact the film would have on action cinema. In 1988, it looked like a well-made crime thriller introducing an unknown martial artist to mainstream audiences. Over the following decades, though, it became recognized as one of the most important action debuts of its era. Its influence extends beyond its immediate commercial success, shaping the careers of those involved, influencing trends within the action genre, and helping define a particular style of action filmmaking that stayed popular throughout the 1990s and beyond. The most obvious and significant part of the film's legacy is the creation of Steven Seagal as a major action star. Before Above the Law, Seagal was known mainly within martial arts circles. After the film's success, he became one of the most recognizable action heroes in the world. The movie effectively laid the foundation for an entire career. Unlike many actors who gradually build their reputations through supporting roles and smaller projects, Seagal entered Hollywood as a leading man, an unusual achievement that immediately set him apart from many of his contemporaries. The success of Above the Law convinced studios that audiences were genuinely drawn to his unique screen presence and fighting style, leading directly to a string of successful films, including Hard to Kill, Marked for Death, Out for Justice, Under Siege, and others. Throughout the early 1990s, Seagal became one of the dominant figures in action cinema, and his rise can be traced directly back to the audience response Above the Law generated. The film also helped establish what became known as the classic Steven Seagal formula. Many of the elements introduced here would reappear throughout his career: the calm, highly skilled protagonist, the themes of corruption and justice, the ties to military or intelligence backgrounds, the emphasis on martial arts efficiency, and the battle against powerful conspiracies. In many ways, Above the Law served as a blueprint, and future Seagal movies often followed a similar structure because audiences responded so well to the combination. The character of Nico Toscani became the prototype for numerous heroes Seagal would go on to play over the next decade. Another major part of the film's legacy involves its influence on action choreography. During the 1980s, martial arts cinema was often associated with highly athletic kicks, acrobatic stunts, and elaborately staged combat. Above the Law introduced mainstream audiences to a different approach. Seagal's Aikido-based fighting style emphasized efficiency over spectacle, with opponents neutralized quickly through throws, joint locks, and leverage-based technique. This created a sense of realism that stood in sharp contrast to many existing action films. As the movie gained popularity, audiences grew increasingly interested in practical, grounded combat styles. Not every action film adopted Aikido specifically, but many productions began incorporating more realistic close-quarters combat into their choreography, and the idea that a hero could be effective through technique rather than brute strength or flashy acrobatics became increasingly common. The film's influence can also be seen in how action heroes developed throughout the 1990s. Before Above the Law, many protagonists were defined primarily by physical power or military hardware. After the film's success, a growing number of action characters combined intelligence, specialized training, investigative skill, and martial arts expertise. The highly trained law enforcement officer or former intelligence operative became a particularly popular character type, and while Above the Law didn't invent this kind of hero, it helped popularize and refine the formula for a new generation of audiences. The movie's blend of political conspiracy and action also contributed to its lasting influence. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, many thrillers began exploring themes of government corruption, corporate misconduct, and institutional failure. Above the Law demonstrated that these subjects could be successfully paired with mainstream action entertainment, and later films frequently adopted a similar approach. Heroes increasingly depicted as individuals fighting not just criminals but corruption within powerful organizations. This narrative structure proved effective because it raised the stakes while still maintaining a personal thread of conflict. Director Andrew Davis benefited significantly from the project's success as well. Even though he'd already shown talent before Above the Law, the film helped solidify his reputation as a director capable of handling suspense, action, and complex narratives, skills that would reach even greater heights in films like The Fugitive. Looking back at his career, many critics point to Above the Law as an early example of his strengths. His emphasis on realism, authentic locations, disciplined storytelling, and believable action all became defining traits of his later work. The movie therefore holds an important place not just in Seagal's career but in Davis's development as a filmmaker. The film's influence also extends into the direct-to-video action market that expanded dramatically during the 1990s and early 2000s. Many producers tried to replicate the formula Above the Law had established, churning out films featuring stoic protagonists with military backgrounds confronting corruption while showing off advanced martial arts skills. Most imitators never reached the same level of success, but their sheer number shows the impact the film had on industry trends. The combination of political intrigue, law enforcement themes, and realistic combat became a recognizable formula that stayed commercially viable for years within martial arts-influenced cinema. The movie also had a noticeable effect on Aikido itself, which received greater international attention after the film's release. One of the most interesting ways to understand the lasting appeal of Above the Law is to look at how audiences have interpreted the film over time. Movies often take on new meaning as generations change, cultural attitudes shift, and historical events reshape how people view the past. Critics tend to focus on technical qualities like acting, direction, and screenplay structure, but audiences often connect with films on a more personal level, shaped by their own emotions, experiences, beliefs, and the social climate in which they first encountered the movie. Above the Law is a great example of how audience interpretation can evolve across decades while the film's core appeal stays intact. When it was originally released in 1988, many viewers responded above all to its freshness. Steven Seagal represented something new in action cinema where audiences had spent years watching heroes defined by enormous muscles, overwhelming firepower, and explosive spectacle, and Nico Toscani offered a different kind of protagonist. Viewers were drawn to his calm demeanor, his intelligence, and his quiet confidence. Unlike heroes who frequently shouted, boasted, or displayed emotional volatility, Nico stayed composed under pressure, and for many audience members, that self-control became one of the character's most appealing qualities. The reaction to Seagal's fighting style was especially strong. Many moviegoers had never seen Aikido demonstrated in a major Hollywood production before, and the techniques looked practical, efficient, and believable. Viewers often described the combat as realistic compared to the exaggerated action typical of the period, and that realism created a sense of authenticity that resonated widely. People felt they were watching a character whose abilities seemed genuinely useful rather than purely cinematic. The action sequences became memorable not simply because they were exciting, but because they felt grounded in reality. Another major factor shaping audience reaction was the film's treatment of corruption and abuse of power. Public trust in institutions during the late 1980s was complicated by various political controversies and historical events, and many viewers already suspected that powerful organizations sometimes operated without enough accountability. So the conspiracy at the heart of Above the Law felt believable to many audience members, and the idea that corrupt individuals might exploit government systems for personal gain didn't seem far-fetched. It reflected concerns already present in society. For these viewers, Nico Toscani became more than an action hero. He represented an ordinary individual willing to challenge powerful institutions in pursuit of justice. That interpretation contributed significantly to the film's emotional impact, since audiences often identify strongly with characters who confront unfair systems, especially when those systems seem too large or powerful for any one person to oppose. Many viewers also connected with the film's emphasis on personal integrity. Throughout the story, Nico repeatedly faces pressure to compromise his principles. He's threatened, obstructed, and isolated, yet he keeps pursuing the truth. Audience members frequently read this determination as admirable, since it reflected values they respected in real life. For many viewers, the film became a story about moral courage. The action sequences were entertaining, but the underlying message about standing up for what's right gave the narrative greater emotional weight, and people often left the movie remembering not just the fights but the character's refusal to surrender his principles. Different generations have interpreted the film in different ways. Audiences who experienced it during its original theatrical run often view it through the lens of late 1980s culture, with the film evoking memories of a specific era in American cinema, a time when practical stunts still dominated action movies, before computer-generated effects became widespread. Many members of this generation appreciate the film's authenticity. They value how physical and tangible the action feels, and the lack of digital enhancement creates a sense of realism that can feel refreshing to modern audiences. For these viewers, The movie serves as both entertainment and nostalgia. The generation that discovered the film during the home video boom of the 1990s often has a different perspective. Many of these viewers encountered Above the Law after Seagal had already become famous, so rather than experiencing the film as an introduction to a new star, they viewed it as the origin point of an already established action icon's career. This audience frequently reads the movie as the purest version of the Steven Seagal formula, recognizing many elements that would later become trademarks of his films as the stoic hero, the political conspiracy, the martial arts expertise, the battle against corruption. Watching Above the Law lets them see where those recurring themes began. Younger viewers discovering the film decades later often approach it from yet another angle. Because they're familiar with modern action cinema, they sometimes notice qualities older audiences took for granted, as the pacing, the practical effects, and the emphasis on investigation can feel unusual next to contemporary blockbusters. Many younger viewers appreciate the movie precisely because it differs from modern action films. The slower pace lets characters and relationships develop, the conspiracy unfolds gradually rather than being explained all at once, and the action relies on physical performance rather than visual effects. Together, these qualities give the film a viewing experience that feels distinctive in the modern era. Audience interpretations of Nico Toscani have also shifted over time. During the original release, many viewers saw him primarily as an aspirational hero, a competent, courageous, and seemingly impossible to intimidate. His confidence represented an ideal that many audience members admired. One reason Above the Law remains more engaging than a lot of action films from the same era is its attention to character development. While the movie is primarily remembered for its action sequences, political conspiracy storyline, and Seagal's martial arts abilities, the narrative also leans heavily on the motivations, decisions, and relationships of its characters. The film's conflicts work because they're driven by people with clear goals, personal histories, and moral convictions. It doesn't offer the deeply psychological character studies you'd find in some dramas, but it succeeds in creating characters whose actions feel meaningful within the story's larger themes of justice, corruption, loyalty, and personal responsibility. At the center of the film stands Nico Toscani, played by Steven Seagal, who serves as both protagonist and moral anchor. Unlike many action heroes who begin their stories as ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, Nico is already highly capable when the film begins. Extensive martial arts training, law enforcement experience, military knowledge, and an intelligence background. That means his arc isn't primarily about learning new skills or growing stronger. Instead, his development centers on reaffirming and testing his existing values. Throughout the film, Nico is repeatedly confronted with situations that challenge his beliefs about justice, authority, and institutional integrity. At the start of the story, he seems confident in his ability to work within the system, believing that investigations, evidence, and lawful procedure can produce justice. But as he uncovers deeper layers of corruption, he begins to realize that some institutions have been compromised by the very people entrusted to protect them, a realization that becomes the foundation of his character journey. The central question isn't whether Nico can defeat his enemies physically. The audience quickly understands he has the skills to survive dangerous confrontations. The more important question is whether he can hold on to his principles while operating in an environment that keeps undermining them. As the conspiracy widens, Nico grows increasingly isolated. Colleagues become unreliable, powerful figures try to silence him, and the risks to his family grow more severe. These pressures force him to decide how much he's willing to sacrifice in pursuit of the truth. What makes Nico compelling is that he refuses to compromise rather than adapt to corruption or accept institutional failure. He doubles down on his commitment to justice. By the film's end, he doesn't emerge as a transformed man but as someone whose convictions have been validated through adversity. His arc, then, is one of moral endurance rather than personal reinvention. Another important dimension of Nico's character is his role as a husband and father. These relationships provide emotional grounding throughout the story. Without them, he might come across as simply an invincible action hero. His family reminds viewers that he has vulnerabilities and responsibilities beyond his professional duties, and his concern for their safety shapes many of his decisions. As threats escalate, the audience sees a tension between his desire to protect his loved ones and his determination to expose corruption. This internal conflict humanizes him and creates emotional stakes that go beyond physical danger. Sarah Toscani, played by Sharon Stone, plays a smaller but meaningful role in Nico's development. Although she gets less screen time than some of the other characters, her presence matters because she represents the personal life Nico is trying to protect. She functions as a source of emotional stability within the narrative, and through her interactions with Nico, viewers gain insight into aspects of his personality that might otherwise stay hidden. He's not simply an investigator or a fighter but also a husband concerned about his family's well-being. Her character reinforces one of the film's recurring themes, that corruption and violence affect ordinary people. The conspiracy isn't merely a political problem, it threatens real families and real lives. And Sarah's role keeps that broader consequence in view. Detective Dolores Jackson, played by Pam Grier, serves as both a professional ally and a moral counterpart to Nico. Throughout the story, she demonstrates many of the same qualities that define the protagonist: integrity, courage, and determination. Unlike some supporting characters who exist solely to assist the hero, Dolores has her own agency and competence. She actively participates in the investigation, contributes valuable insights, and repeatedly proves herself capable in dangerous situations. Her relationship with Nico is built on mutual respect. They trust each other because they share similar values around justice and accountability, and that partnership strengthens the narrative by keeping Nico from feeling completely isolated. Dolores represents the possibility that honest individuals still exist within compromised institutions, and although her character arc is less pronounced than Nico's, she reinforces the film's central message that meaningful resistance to corruption often requires cooperation between principled people. The primary antagonist, Kurt Zagan, played by Silva, functions as a dark mirror of many of the themes Nico embodies. While Nico uses his skills and experience to protect others, Zagan uses power and influence for personal gain. Zagan represents the corrupting potential of authority. He has knowledge, connections, and resources similar to what's available to the protagonist, but his moral choices have taken him down a very different path. That contrast makes him more than a simple villain. He embodies the danger of abandoning ethical principles in pursuit of power. Where Nico stays loyal to justice despite personal risk, Zagan sacrifices morality for control and self-preservation. Their conflict, then, becomes ideological as well as physical. Zagan doesn't undergo significant development over the course of the story, but his role is essential. He personifies the corruption Nico opposes, and every confrontation between them reinforces the larger thematic battle between integrity and abuse of power. Although Above the Law is primarily remembered for its action sequences, political conspiracy narrative, and Steven Seagal's screen debut, the film's costume and set design play a significant role in establishing its realism and supporting its storytelling. Unlike fantasy films, historical epics, or science fiction productions that rely on elaborate visual worlds, Above the Law operates within a contemporary urban setting, which creates a unique challenge for the filmmakers. The story takes place in a world audiences recognize immediately, so every costume, location, prop, and set has to feel authentic. If any visual element feels artificial or exaggerated, the illusion of realism can fall apart quickly. The design philosophy behind the film is grounded in practicality. Rather than drawing attention to itself, The costume and production design work to create a believable world populated by real people. This subtle approach might seem less noticeable than the extravagant visuals found in bigger productions, but it's essential to the film's effectiveness, as the realism of the environments and clothing helps convince viewers that the conspiracy, corruption, and danger at the story's center could genuinely exist. The most important costume in the film belongs to Nico Toscani. Throughout the movie, Steven Seagal's wardrobe establishes both his profession and his personality. Unlike many 1980s action heroes who wore highly stylized outfits designed to emphasize their physicality, Nico dresses in a relatively understated way: practical jackets, shirts, slacks, and police-appropriate attire that reflect his dual identity as both a law enforcement officer and a former intelligence operative. He looks professional without appearing overly formal, and capable without appearing theatrical. This choice matters because it reinforces the film's commitment to realism. Nico is presented as a working detective rather than a comic book superhero, and his clothes suggest functionality rather than image, letting him move naturally through investigations, confrontations, and action sequences while maintaining credibility. The darker colors frequently associated with his wardrobe also contribute to his characterization. Blacks, grays, dark blues, and earth tones dominate many of his outfits, communicating seriousness, discipline, and authority, and visually setting him apart from the brighter, more flamboyant style sometimes associated with action cinema during the decade. At the same time, his clothing subtly emphasizes his confidence. He never seems overly concerned with fashion or appearance, and his wardrobe reflects a man focused on responsibilities rather than self-promotion, supporting the character's calm, disciplined personality throughout the narrative. Sarah Toscani's costumes serve a very different purpose. As Nico's wife, she represents the personal, domestic side of his life, and her clothing choices are generally warm, approachable, and grounded in everyday reality. Unlike characters directly involved in the conspiracy or law enforcement world, Sarah's wardrobe emphasizes normalcy. This contrast is important because it highlights what Nico stands to lose as the audience sees a family life worth protecting, and Sarah's appearance helps establish a sense of stability and humanity that balances the darker aspects of the story. Sharon Stone's costumes also reflect her character's role in the narrative. She appears stylish and attractive without seeming disconnected from the film's realistic tone. The wardrobe communicates that she's intelligent, capable, and independent while staying believable within the story's world. Pam Grier's detective Dolores Jackson is dressed in a way that reflects both professionalism and strength. Her wardrobe supports her role as a competent law enforcement officer, and unlike some action films that lean on stereotypes or exaggerated appearances, above the law presents Dolores as a serious professional. Practical jackets, professional attire, and understated accessories all help establish her credibility. The audience immediately understands that she belongs in the investigative world of the story. She looks like someone capable of handling dangerous situations and making difficult decisions. This costume design also reflects broader changes happening in cinema during the 1980s. As female characters in action and crime films were increasingly portrayed as professionals rather than decorative figures. Dolores's wardrobe supports that evolution by emphasizing competence over spectacle. The villains are also defined visually through costume choices. Kurt Zagan and the other antagonists frequently appear in attire associated with authority, influence, and power. Suits and expensive, professional-looking clothing that communicate their standing within social and political hierarchies. This creates an important visual contrast. The individuals responsible for corruption often look respectable and successful, and their appearance suggests legitimacy, reinforcing one of the film's central themes, that corruption frequently hides behind respectable facades. The costume design, in other words, contributes directly to the narrative, reminding viewers that dangerous individuals don't always appear threatening. Often, they blend seamlessly into institutions and social structures that seem trustworthy. Set design plays an equally important role throughout the film. Because Above the Law is rooted in urban realism, locations become critical storytelling tools. The filmmakers combine practical locations with carefully designed interiors to build a believable world. Police stations are among the most important environments in the film, designed to feel functional rather than glamorous. Desks, filing cabinets, paperwork, telephones, and fluorescent lighting create an atmosphere consistent with real law enforcement facilities. The realism of these sets helps establish credibility. Viewers believe investigations are genuinely taking place because the environments feel authentic. The police station becomes a symbol of institutional authority, which makes the later revelations of corruption land even harder. The screenplay of Above the Law is one of the film's most important, yet often overlooked, strengths. While many viewers primarily remember the movie for launching Steven Seagal's career, introducing his distinctive martial arts style, and delivering a compelling conspiracy thriller, none of those elements would have worked without a script capable of supporting them. The screenplay is the foundation the entire film is built on. It establishes the characters, develops the mystery, builds tension, and delivers the themes of justice, corruption, and accountability that drive the narrative. Although Above the Law is fundamentally an action movie, its script shows a surprising level of discipline and intelligence compared to many genre films of the same period. One of the screenplay's greatest strengths is its structure. Rather than functioning as a series of action sequences strung together by minimal story, the film unfolds as a carefully organized narrative that gradually reveals itself. Information comes in stages, letting the audience participate in the investigation alongside Nico Toscani. This immediately separates Above the Law from many action movies of the late 1980s. In lesser films, viewers often know exactly who the villains are from the start and simply wait for the inevitable confrontation. Here, the screenplay creates genuine intrigue by making the conspiracy itself a mystery. The audience learns new information at roughly the same pace as the protagonist, and each clue leads to more questions, keeping viewers actively engaged. This investigative structure helps sustain momentum throughout the film and ensures that dialogue scenes matter just as much as the action sequences. The script also benefits from a strong sense of pacing. Exposition is doled out carefully rather than dumped all at once, often revealed through conversations, discoveries, and confrontations that feel natural within the story. That matters especially here, given how much the plot involves political corruption, intelligence operations, and complex criminal networks. A less disciplined screenplay could easily become confusing or overwhelming. Instead, Above the Law generally introduces information in manageable pieces, letting audiences absorb developments without losing track of the central narrative. Dialogue serves multiple purposes throughout the film. At its most basic, it communicates plot information and advances the investigation, but the screenplay frequently uses conversation to reveal character traits, establish relationships, and reinforce thematic concerns. Nico Toscani's dialogue is especially significant in defining his personality. Unlike many action heroes who lean on jokes, exaggerated one-liners, or emotional outbursts, Nico speaks with confidence and restraint. His words are usually direct, purposeful, and focused. This style contributes greatly to his identity. Nico rarely wastes words, tending to say only what's necessary, which creates an impression of discipline and self-control that aligns perfectly with his martial arts background and professional experience. For audiences, this restrained dialogue became one of Steven Seagal's defining traits. The calm delivery and measured speech set him apart from many of his contemporaries. Some critics later argued the style limited emotional expression, but many viewers read it as a sign of confidence and competence. The screenplay consistently reinforces Nico's moral convictions through dialogue. His conversations frequently emphasize honesty, justice, and personal responsibility, but rather than delivering lengthy speeches about ethics, the script usually communicates these values through practical decisions and concise statements. This approach works because it avoids excessive exposition and the audience understands what Nico believes, not because he constantly explains his philosophy, but because his words and actions stay consistent throughout the story. Pam Grier's character, Detective Dolores Jackson, also benefits from strong dialogue. Her conversations establish her as intelligent, capable, and professional, and the screenplay treats her as a genuine partner rather than simply a supporting figure, an important distinction that gives her real agency within the narrative. Dolores contributes to investigations, asks meaningful questions, and provides insights that move the story forward, and her dialogue reflects experience and competence, making her an essential part of the film rather than merely an accessory to the protagonist. The interactions between Nico and Dolores work particularly well because they feel natural. Their conversations demonstrate mutual respect and trust without needing extensive explanation, and the screenplay lets the audience infer the strength of their professional relationship through behavior rather than overt exposition. The antagonists are similarly defined through dialogue. Kurt Zagan and the other corrupt figures often speak in a way that reflects their power and influence, revealing confidence, arrogance, and a belief that they operate beyond accountability. One of the screenplay's more effective techniques is its refusal to make the villains overly theatrical rather than delivering constant threats or exaggerated declarations of evil intent. Many antagonists communicate calmly and in a controlled manner. This restraint makes them feel more realistic, and therefore more dangerous. The script understands that corruption often appears respectable on the surface, so the villains frequently sound professional and reasonable even while discussing unethical activities, a contrast that reinforces the film's broader themes around hidden corruption and abuse of authority. Tension is another area where the screenplay excels, and much of it emerges through dialogue rather than action. Conversations often carry hidden meanings, incomplete information, or subtle threats, and many exchanges involve characters who clearly know more than they're willing to reveal. This creates uncertainty and keeps audiences paying close attention, since the screenplay frequently lets tension build gradually rather than relying solely on immediate confrontation. The marketing campaign for Above the Law was one of the more interesting promotional challenges faced by a Hollywood studio in the late 1980s. Unlike many major action films of that era, the movie couldn't lean on the star power of an established celebrity to draw audiences. Steven Seagal was completely unknown to mainstream moviegoers and no previous film career, no recognizable roles, no built-in fan base outside martial arts circles. The marketing team faced a unique task, convincing audiences to buy tickets for a movie starring someone they'd never seen before, while simultaneously presenting him as the next great action hero. Looking back, the promotional strategy was remarkably effective. Rather than hiding the fact that Seagal was new to Hollywood, the campaign turned his unfamiliarity into an advantage, focusing heavily on what made him different from existing action stars. Instead of presenting him as another version of Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone, or Chuck Norris, the promotional materials emphasized that audiences were about to experience something they'd never seen before. That strategy became one of the key reasons the film generated so much curiosity before and during its theatrical run. The theatrical poster served as a centerpiece of the campaign. The design was relatively straightforward but highly effective. Steven Seagal was positioned prominently, often holding a weapon or standing in a confident pose that communicated strength and authority, immediately conveying the image of a serious action hero. The title itself was an important marketing asset, short, memorable, and instantly suggestive of themes of corruption, power, and justice. Even viewers who knew nothing about the plot could infer that the story involved dangerous individuals operating beyond legal accountability. The title carried an inherent sense of intrigue, promising both action and conspiracy, two elements enormously popular with audiences during the late 1980s. Many posters and print ads highlighted Seagal's martial arts expertise. Promotional copy frequently referenced his real-world background, emphasizing that he wasn't simply an actor portraying a martial artist. He was a genuine martial arts master bringing authentic skills to the screen. That distinction became a major selling point. Audiences were increasingly drawn to martial arts cinema following the influence of performers like Bruce Lee and the growing popularity of hand-to-hand combat action films, and by presenting Seagal as a legitimate expert rather than merely a performer, the marketing campaign added an extra layer of credibility. The trailers played an even more important role in introducing Seagal to audiences, precisely because he was unknown. Viewers needed to see him in action before deciding whether he was worth watching. The trailers therefore focused heavily on fight sequences, emphasizing the unique qualities of his Aikido-based combat style. Many action trailers of the era relied on explosions, car chases, and gunfire, and while Above the Law certainly included those elements, the marketing placed particular emphasis on Seagal's ability to defeat opponents through throws, locks, and fluid movement. This immediately set the film apart from its competitors. Audiences watching the trailers saw something unfamiliar and intriguing, with combat that appeared realistic, efficient, and powerful. The novelty of the fighting style became one of the campaign's strongest assets. The trailers also highlighted the film's conspiracy narrative. Scenes involving investigations, government corruption, and political intrigue suggested the movie offered more than simple action, which helped attract viewers interested in thrillers and crime dramas alongside traditional action fans. The marketing team understood that the conspiracy angle could expand the audience beyond martial arts enthusiasts, and by emphasizing both action and mystery, the campaign positioned the film as a more sophisticated thriller rather than a straightforward combat movie. Television advertising was another crucial part of the promotional strategy. In the late 1980s, TV commercials remain one of the most effective ways to reach mass audiences, and short promotional spots aired during popular programming introduced viewers to Seagal's screen presence while showcasing key action moments. These ads typically focused on three elements: the hero's martial arts abilities, the dangerous conspiracy, and the promise of intense action. By repeating these points consistently, the campaign built a clear, unified message, and audiences quickly understood what kind of experience the film was offering. Word-of-mouth promotion proved equally important after the movie's release. Unlike modern marketing campaigns that lean heavily on social media, films in 1988 depended significantly on audience recommendations. Many moviegoers left theaters talking about Seagal's fighting style. Friends recommended the film to friends, and conversation centered on how different the action looked compared to other movies of the period. This organic publicity became one of the campaign's most valuable assets, effectively extending the reach of the official marketing effort through positive audience reactions. The studio also benefited from strategic media coverage. Interviews and promotional appearances introduced Seagal to the public while emphasizing his unusual background. Journalists were intrigued by the story of a martial arts instructor transitioning directly into a leading man role, a narrative that felt refreshingly different from the traditional Hollywood success story. Articles frequently discussed Seagal's training, his years in Japan, and his expertise in Aikido, helping build an image of authenticity around both the actor and the film. Another important part of the marketing involved positioning the movie within broader action cinema trends, since the late 1980s were an especially competitive period for the genre, with studios constantly looking for ways to distinguish their projects from one another. To fully appreciate the significance of Above the Law, it helps to compare it with other action films from its era, similar crime thrillers, and the later movies that followed the path it helped establish. This kind of comparison shows what makes the film unique, where it fits within the evolution of action cinema, and why it's still remembered decades after its release. While Above the Law shares plenty of characteristics with other late 1980s action movies, it also introduced several elements that set it apart from its contemporaries and helped shape future trends within the genre. One of the most obvious comparisons is with the major action films that dominated the 1980s. Stars like Arnold Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone defined the genre during this period, with films like Commando, Predator, Rambo, First Blood Part 2, and Cobra featuring heroes who relied heavily on physical power, overwhelming firepower, and spectacular action. Compared to these films, Above the Law feels considerably more restrained and grounded. Nico Toscani is certainly capable of extraordinary feats, but he isn't portrayed as a larger-than-life superhuman figure. Instead, he operates as a detective and investigator whose combat skills support his mission rather than define it entirely. That difference is especially noticeable in the action scenes. Schwarzenegger's characters often solve problems through sheer strength and military hardware. Stallone's heroes frequently survive impossible situations through determination and endurance. Nico, by contrast, relies on technique, intelligence, and precision, creating a very different viewing experience. Another useful comparison is with the films of Chuck Norris. Throughout the 1980s, Norris had become one of the most recognizable martial arts action stars in America, with movies like The Delta Force and Invasion USA presenting him as a highly capable fighter battling overwhelming threats. While Norris and Seagal both brought genuine martial arts expertise to the screen, their styles differ dramatically. Norris's action scenes emphasize karate-based striking and traditional martial arts choreography, while Seagal's aikido-based approach focuses on throws, joint locks, and redirected force. This distinction helped Above the Law stand out immediately. Audiences already familiar with martial arts cinema encountered something that felt genuinely new. Rather than competing directly with existing stars, Seagal occupied a different niche within the genre. The film can also be compared to the work of Jean-Claude Van Damme, whose career was starting to rise around the same time. Movies like Bloodsport and Kickboxer focus heavily on tournament fighting, personal challenges, and athletic combat. Above the Law differs significantly here, because martial arts serve the story rather than becoming the story itself. The film's primary focus remains the conspiracy investigation, and fighting happens because the narrative calls for it, not because the plot revolves around competition or martial arts achievement. This integration of action into a larger thriller framework gave the movie broader appeal. Viewers interested in political intrigue, crime stories, and law enforcement narratives could enjoy the film even without being dedicated martial arts fans. Another important comparison involves the police thrillers of the 1980s. Films like Lethal Weapon and Beverly Hills Cop combine law enforcement stories with action and humor, often emphasizing partnerships, witty dialogue, and character-driven relationships. Above the Law adopts a more serious tone. Humor exists but stays limited, with the focus placed on investigation, corruption, and moral responsibility rather than comedic interaction. As a result, the movie feels darker and more politically charged than many contemporary police thrillers, aligning more closely with conspiracy-driven films than traditional buddy cop adventures. The atmosphere emphasizes danger, secrecy, and institutional corruption rather than entertainment built on personality clashes or comedic misunderstandings.